Our guest today writes that it's important that people understand the court, the Supreme Court, an extremely powerful but poorly misunderstood branch. Leah Littman is a professor of law at University of Michigan Law School, a former Supreme Court clerk, the author of a new book called Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. It's a book about the court that's really easy to read and understand. And Professor Littman joins me now. Leah, it's good to see you. Congratulations on it. It's really easy reading for non-lawyers to get through. Let me start here. Chief Justice John Roberts famously said that it's the job of the court to call balls and strikes. It's not about their personal politics. Is that what we're seeing play out in today's court?
No, I don't think so. So first, I think it's important to remember that umpires actually play a role. Refs play a role in constructing what the strike zone is. It's not a ball or a strike until an umpire calls it. So even that statement, I think, understates the extent to which judges have a role in shaping what the law is. They're not just declaring things as they are or universally understood to be. But as I document in the book, I think that a lot of the justices' worldview and ideology is actually shaping the law. Sometimes they just declare their feelings to be the law. Other times they are laundering Republican talking points and making those the law as well. So I think a close analysis of the oral arguments, as well as the opinions the justices are releasing, reveals a much more complicated picture, to say the least.
Yeah, you write that political polarization is what's been leading to the court shift to the right. There are justices who they're called originalists or strict constructionists. Their view is if the words are not in the Constitution, that right doesn't exist. And there's others who see the Constitution as a living, breathing document. That said, let me just look at a couple of areas with you. Abortion, for example, because even there, that was not a law, not certainly a right that was in the Constitution. And Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself said it's really kind of a poorly reasoned decision. So is Dobbs out of line with what the Constitution tells us?
I think Dobbs is out of line with what the Constitution tells us. And when Justice Ginsburg was criticizing the Roe opinion, she actually faulted it for focusing too much on the rights of doctors rather than the rights of women who wanted to receive health care. She would have grounded the decision in equal protection, the Constitution's prohibitions on discrimination on the basis of sex. But Justice Alito's opinion rejected that as a possible basis for a constitutional right to decide whether to have an abortion as well. Also, I think the idea that the Constitution protects some rights that are not specifically or explicitly listed in the Constitution is actually way more justifiable than the Dobbs majority lets on. After all, the Constitution safeguards the privileges and immunities of citizenship, but doesn't describe what those privileges and immunities are. Similarly, the Due Process Clause protects liberty, but doesn't define what's encompassed in liberty. So, of course, the Constitution is going to protect some rights that are not spelled out in explicit terms in the Constitution text.
We know LGBTQ issues making their way back to the court in various forms. Some believe that same-sex marriage, which was determined to be constitutional in 2015, that may see a turnaround going forward. My question is, to what extent do justices take a look at the tenor and tone of what's going on in society today and let that influence? Because they may be conservatives, but the culture has shifted in a way that's more accepting of same-sex marriage.
Yes, I think that's right. I think people should remember that in 2016, Donald Trump ran on a Republican Party platform that promised to appoint justices who would not only overrule Roe versus Wade, but who would also overrule Obergefell versus Hodges, the marriage equality decision as well. Now, I agree that public opinion does provide some sort of check on the Supreme Court, and the justices, or at least some of them, are a little wary of straying too far from public opinion. That being said, I think the Supreme Court has become more and more removed from the public, in part because Congress, the Senate, and the presidency have become more removed from the public as well. And that has allowed them to reach decisions that are more unpopular and are really only supported by a narrow minority of the country.
When we look at the executive power immunity decision of last term, which was really just extreme for what most courts were expected to do, including every court underneath it, it looks as though the check on the executive branch, since Congress has sort of checked out, the legislature, the check seems to be the lower courts, that's where the Constitution is getting enforced, and then the Supreme Court does what it does. Are you seeing it the same way?
Yeah, so I think the immunity opinion is a perfect example of a case where the Republican justices on the Supreme Court felt Very comfortable reaching a decision that the vast majority of the American public does not support and embraced a pretty fringe theory. I'm also concerned that they are not yet willing to have the backs of the lower courts, who have thus far attempted to enforce the law against the administration, stand up for the rule of law, and stand up against the administration. The Supreme Court has blocked several lower court rulings that had gone against the administration, including the initial decision that had blocked the administration from carrying out the Alien Enemies Act expulsions on a nationwide basis. And there are other examples as well. Just last week, the court allowed Donald Trump to fire two officials in violation of federal law, commissioners on the National Labor Relations Board, as well as the Merit Service Protections Board, that lower courts had attempted to prohibit him from doing. So thus far, the Supreme Court has not been willing to kind of stand with the lower courts that have attempted to enforce the law against the administration.
I've always had a sense the Supreme Court was they'd be behind the times. Brown versus Board, 1954, the notion of segregation, all of that. It always seemed the Supreme Court was behind the where society was going. Is it still that way now? We talked about whether it's related to it, but is it still lagging behind the country?
I think the court is not just lagging behind the country, it is attempting to push the country back before the 20th and 21st century. So now you have a Supreme Court that is really enmeshed in the backlash to the civil rights movement, backlash to LGBT equality, backlash to feminism and women's rights. And so they are not just lagging behind, but in some ways are engaged in a counter-revolution that is attempting to roll back rights that society and laws had embraced.
Very quickly, what is it that takes a justice like David Souter, who starts conservative, goes liberal, Harry Blackmun, same thing? What changes somebody once they get on the court?
I think it is an attention to the facts and an attention to public opinion. That's part of why the Federalist Society exists, to try to counter the national media that had brought facts to the justices' attention and theories to the justices' attention that they embraced once they were on the Supreme Court.
And finally, the question is, people watch us, read the book, what can we do if we want to see some kind of change? Protesting outside the court is daily, doesn't do anything. The answer is really in the legislature, right? Change who you vote for. That's where the impact is.
I think that's right. I think public information and public education is a first step and precondition to voting. I think people also underestimate the significance of state and local races and how much power state courts and state judges have to really address some of the fallout from the United States Supreme Court's decisions.
Well, congratulations again. Easy to read book. I encourage non-lawyers to check it out. Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. Leah Littman, thanks for being with us. You can check her out on social media or simonandschuster.com. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you.